So this is a short lecture on what we call the demographic transition. This is based off of our observations of countries that have already gone through this transition. So you can see here on the right, it's countries like the US, Japan, France, United Kingdom, other countries in Europe, Germany. And we've observed through the data the patterns of death rate, you can see here, and birth rate, and also the resulting population size as these countries have gone through these transitions. So what we want to do is kind of look at some of these different stages and some of the aspects of them to understand what could very well happen for a large percentage of the human population. First, you have this kind of high stationary stage, stage 1. And keep in mind, this is, the examples are rare. There's only really a few remote groups, possibly tribal groups in areas that, deep in a rainforest, for example, that might still experience this type of stage. And what you have here is both a high birth rate and a high death rate. What that means is you have a lot of children being born, that high fertility rate, but also many of them are dying. They're not surviving to adulthood. They're not surviving to reproduce themselves. So it's a difficult life. It's not one that most of us would be familiar with in any way. And when you have the death rate equal to the birth rate up here, you have growth rate equal to 0. And you can see that in population size down here not growing. It's basically flat. What can happen, though, is as a population transitions into the second stage, you start to see death rate starts to go down. And there's a number of different reasons why that can be. You have, and you can see down here at the bottom, you've got things like improvements in medical care, water supply, sanitation, fewer children are dying. And that's going to be an interesting one because you'll actually see, as we've talked about before, decreased infant mortality both decreases death rate, but you'll also see it coming in later as a trigger to also decrease birth rate. And you can see, again, still the birth rate, though, is still remaining high. So you can see in this early expanding that the birth rate is still quite high here. And that's why they call it expanding, is because of this difference here between birth rate and death rate. When birth rate is higher than death rate, population size is going up. And there's basically there's a couple of different reasons why birth rate stays high. One, there's not as much of a motivation for birth rate to be lower. Having more children potentially is beneficial. So if you've got a situation where, for example, there's a lot of farming and you're in a rural community, then having a larger family size may be an actual benefit. There's no real family planning. There's no real tools to decrease fertility rates. And so birth rates can remain high. And because death rates are going down and more children are surviving, it's also easier to maintain a larger family. So again, less of a motivation to decrease family size if that's a benefit. You might also consider the fact that your children in some of these situations are your Social Security, your retirement. You need to have a large family because those are the people that are going to take care of you as you get older. Now, one of the key aspects here is what triggers this decrease in birth rate then. And we talked a little bit about that before. We were talking about what decreases, the number of children that are being born per family. And again, you have this improved medical care and diet down in here. You can see this. And the fewer children needed. This could also be where you're getting more of kind of the rural to urban transition as more and more people now are moving into cities for jobs. Education starts to become very important. And again, because also this kind of lag in societal reaction to the fact that infant mortality has gone down. And so as infant mortality has gone down, eventually it triggers families to just have fewer children. They don't need to have as many children because their children now have a much greater chance of surviving. As they kind of, continue down this road of decreasing birth rate, you're seeing, again, kind of education becoming not just important, but now it's largely becoming essential for children to survive and to succeed in this kind of more urban, more industrialized society. And education costs money. And so the more children you have, the more money you need to send them to this educational system, for example, going through like K-12 and then eventually into college or even more advanced degrees. You're also seeing, again, improvements in healthcare, continued decrease in infant mortality. A key aspect, of course, here too are women are now having greater opportunities outside of the home. They're able to get access to that education. They're able to find employment opportunities. They're developing careers. They're waiting longer before they have children. And so, again, the longer females delay childbirth in a population, the slower the population growth rate, the fewer children they'll have in their lifetime. Eventually, that birth rate starts to come down and again start to equal death rate. Now, again, during this time, keep in mind, you still have this higher birth rate than death rate. And that's why you see this, expanding over here and expanding here, because all during this time, population size is going up. Eventually, as that birth rate hits to about the same level of death rate, again, you're seeing it leveling off. Now, again, growth rate equals 0 when it levels off. One of the things that can continue to happen, though, and again, here's kind of a key aspect, is here's U.S., Japan, France, United Kingdom. This is about where we are. The only reason, again, that, and remember, as we've mentioned before, as of 2019, the growth rate in the U.S. is about 0.48%. And so it's very close to 0. But the thing that's keeping it positive and the thing that's preventing it from going negative is actually immigration. It's less birth rates and more actually people coming in from the outside to take advantage of the opportunities that are here in the U.S. As you keep moving forward, you actually have the potential where the death rate is maybe possibly hit. It's the lowest it can get. People can't continue to live forever, of course. But the birth rate continues to go down. People simply choose to have fewer and fewer children. So now instead of having on average 2 children per couple, now that number is going below 2. And one of the things you'll see is, if you look at the news, for example, Japan is actually entering into that zone. Germany's in that zone. And it presents its own series of challenges because now you have growth rate less than 0. And that means there's fewer children being born than in previous generations, and that means fewer people that are able to occupy necessary jobs, for example, to go into the military, and who are paying into things like Social Security and other aspects of retirement that's necessary for the aging population that's leaving the workforce. So this is, in essence, kind of the general trend that's happened through countries that have gone through it. And the question, of course, is with all of these countries, and you can see them in here, Egypt, Kenya, India, most of Africa is really in these early expanding to late expanding zones. Can they actually go through this transition in a way that still provides a high quality of life? So let's look at, again, here's just the same type of graph, but I've just really simplified it. So you have the death rate, the birth rate, and the population size. And here's really where this comes into play is all of this time in here where you have the birth rate higher than the death rate, you're getting this rapid population growth. For countries in, for example, the continent of Africa, this is where that, tripling, 3 to 4 times population size that's happening in these UN projections is as they're going through these early and late expanding zones. one of the key questions is can a country survive that? Can they actually make it through the transition with that rapid? So can they make it through with that rapid population size? And one of the great challenges that they have is as population is growing, as it's in this rapid population growth, that's putting more and more pressure on a country's infrastructure. So if you think about things like education, if you're thinking, things like healthcare, food supply, medical care, healthcare, jobs, the availability of jobs, all of those things can be difficult to provide for everybody in the population when your population is growing quickly. If more and more children are being born and they aren't getting the education, the healthcare, if they're struggling with food, if they can't find jobs, then you're going to see potentially an increase in disease. You're going to see an increase in famine. You're probably going to see an increase in crime and also possibly increase in other types of conflict, tribal warfares, regional warfares that cause the death rate to then kick back up again because of the stresses put on that particular country. And what you can end up happening is you get this kind of loop where a country gets stuck in one of these kind of early to late expanding phases, and they never actually get through. They keep growing quickly in population size, that then turns around and kicks death rates back up again, preventing them from continuing through the transition to eventually get to this, what we might consider kind of more industrialized system that tends to have a higher quality of life, higher wealth, higher access to education, et cetera, things that we, for example, enjoy here in the U.S. Now, can we, in essence, one of the key things is can we take, and I'll bring in a new color here so it's a little bit easier to see, is can we turn this birth rate down sooner so that it comes down along with death rate or very soon after, so that if you have the lower or a smaller difference between that birth rate and the death rate, then this population growth ends up being much less. And by being much less, now you have a much less of a stress on all of these issues here. And a country has greater time to build up the infrastructure to provide for this population size. And of course, one of the key things is you also end up at a much lower population size in the end, which may be easier for a country to maintain the infrastructure necessary. And of course, that also means decreased resource use, decreased pollution associated with it, and overall a decreased global impact. So one of the things that's going to determine whether or not the human population can be sustainable in the long run is whether or not the countries that are in these kind of early and late expanding stages, which represents about 70 to 80% of the current human population, if we can find a way to turn that birth rate down more rapidly and parallel the death rate, at the same time also through the expansion of certain types of technology, decrease their environmental impacts as they go through this demographic transition, so that countries can end up in this zone with a lower population that grows more slowly, rather than up here that could result in, instead of actually achieving that, back in this kind of tragic loop that keeps them stuck in the earlier late expanding zones.